let's learn how to make this typing effect using Blender's geometry nodes. So the first thing we'll do is just click this light and press X to delete that. We'll leave the camera because we'll use that later. Let's click the cube, go up to Geometry Nodes tab up here, and click New to create a new geometry node setup. We don't need the cube, so we can delete this group input because we're going to add our own geometry. So to get the text on the screen, let's Shift A to add a string to curve. And we can Alt Shift left click the strings to curves node to connect that to the output. So let's go ahead and add our text. We'll keep going with the matrix theme. And this lays out flats. We'll go to the top view, and to fill that in, Shift A and add a fill curve. I'm going to set it to n-gon. But actually, let's make this string here, let's make this text a group input so that we can change this however we want from the modifier stack here. So press N to pull up the sidebar, and that will let us configure some of the properties of this input. We can change this to be text, type a string, default, we'll make that blank. So now I want to set the font, and I had to do a lookup, but the font that was used on the matrix, because I want this to look like a matrix theme, is Courier New, but you can load in whatever font you like for your design. Actually, while we're at it, let's Shift A, add a transform geometry, and let's rotate that 90 degrees on X, just so we can see it from the front. It's just a lot easier to tumble on the front. So flat here is okay. If you want, you can add an extrude mesh node to give that a bit of depth. We're probably going to be rendering this orthographically in an orthographic camera, so it'll be flat anyway. We won't really see the depth of this text. Just note, for other projects though, when you extrude text, it does have unfilled geometry in the back. But for this project, that's totally okay. All right, let's put a frame around this here. Control J, F2, and we'll call that text. So the way we'll make this look like a text typing effect is we'll use the delete geometry node, and we'll play with the selection. If we pull in an index input and a compare node, I can show you really quick what that will look like. So we'll delete from the instances domain all the geometry that has an index greater than some value. So as this index here increases, it reveals the text. And we'll make this procedural in that it will be driven by the scene time, but also it will depend on a duration that we can specify to specify how fast the text should appear on screen. So let's bring in that piece where we can specify with a group input how fast this text should type. So we'll pull in a math node, and we want to figure out, using divide, we want to figure out what duration each letter should appear on the screen. So if we were to bring in a group input, which we'll call typing duration, if we were to make this 5 seconds, and the text had 5 characters, then it's 5 seconds divided by how many characters, because we want each character to appear by the end of this duration. So it would be 1 second per character. So we're close in expressing that here. We have the 5 seconds per character. We need to figure out how many characters are in the string. So we can bring in a string length node. And the string here is the group input that we had called text. So now this piece here, Control J F2, is calculating our seconds per instance. So now let's connect this to be driven by the scene's time. Let's delete this index here. And the way we can think about this is that using the seconds, the scene seconds, we want to delete the instances that have a duration greater than the seconds that has elapsed. That's a little confusing. What I mean is, in this case, the first character should appear at 1 second, at 2 seconds, 2 seconds, at 3 seconds, 4 seconds. So if only 2 seconds has gone into the animation, these characters should be deleted. We can get those values, the time at which they should be on screen, by just taking the index, and we can multiply, Alt-P to remove that from the frame. We can multiply that index by the seconds per instance. And then if this value is greater than the scene time, whoops, this should be seconds, not the frame. Now we delete the additional characters. So I'm going to go to my output tab here and change this to 30 FPS and go back to the modifier. Now at 30 frames, that's 1 full second. So we start to show at each stop here, 30, 60, 90. I'm off by 1, it seems. Right, okay, so I was expecting only 1 to be on the screen at 1 second elapsed, but because the first character is actually at duration 0, it appears instantly, and then after the next second, 2, 3, etc. So that's okay for now. We'll leave that. So now we have 5 seconds. Let's give us a bit more time. I'm just going to say like 500 frames. And let's put this back to wake up geo ... Now if we go to the very start, we'll have to fix this issue later where the first character is always there, but we also need to change from integer, this needs to be a float, and reconnect that again. Just because we're not dealing with integer values here. We're not dealing with integer values. We definitely want the fractional part to be assigned for each instance, for each character. And this should be times as well. All right, and now with those fixes, we should be able to press spacebar and see that all this text appears within the 5 second duration that we specified. But right now it's pretty boring in that it's perfectly spaced out. There's no variation in the typing. So let's add a little bit of randomness just to make it feel a little more natural. And all we need to do for that is we have this duration, this rate specified here, which is how many characters per second. If we take a multiply node and we change that to add, we can add a little bit of randomness with a random value. We'll leave it on float, but we'll say we'll add plus or minus 0.5 to how often those keys appear. And this might be too much time depending on the length of your text. And if we play it back, you can see that some of the letters appear out of order depending on how the plus or minus is applied. So let's take this add node, let's change it to a multiply, and that'll let us just tweak the strength of this randomness so that it matches up better for the text that we have here. I'm going to actually change this end to about 160. So it takes a little bit of tweaking, and if you don't like necessarily how it's adding the variation like that I didn't like, you can just change the seed to find the feel that you're going for. So let's group these, or not group, but add a frame, Control J, F2, call it variation. So that's the variation in our typing. And to make this a little bit more interesting while we work on it, let's go into the materials tab here. Let's add an emission. We'll crank it to about 8. We'll give it a bit of a green, kind of greenish yellow color. And we'll call this green. In the node graph here, let's add a set material node and select green. And in the 3D viewport, press Z and go to material preview. And I want to make sure we're not using, that we are using the scene world and the scene lights. And our world is really bright right now, so we'll go into the world tab and turn the strength right down to 0. Also, because we're in Blender 4.2, we need to make our own bloom. So go into the compositing tab up here, click use nodes, Shift A to add a glare node, change streaks to bloom, mix to -0.9, and size will bring down maybe to like a 5. And we can't see that right now, but maybe we'll change this to a 3D viewport here and go back to material preview. And I guess we have to go over here and do the scene light, scene world again. The last piece is to, in that drop down, select always for the compositor. So you're seeing the compositor's effects in the 3D viewport. So that's not too bad. We can play with the size. Yeah, I think I like that better. These are integer. We can't get anything in between 4 and 5. Maybe I'll leave it. Yeah, I'll leave it at 5. Okay. So back to geometry nodes. And here we'll go back and do the always as well. And I'm going to press Alt-Shift-Z, and that just gets rid of all of the overlays there. Perfect. So the last piece that I want to add to this is I want to be able to specify a delay, how long the scene will wait before text starts to appear, how long that typing will take, and then one last delay when all the text is there before the text is completely erased. And doing this will let us set up several different typing sequences. This is like a roundabout way that I was just playing with in Blender. I don't know how this text effect is done in other programs, but this is just what I came up with. So let's first add the start delay. We only want to start showing geometry after the start delay has passed. So what we can do is just Shift-D this add node. We'll Alt-P to remove that from the frame. And then I want to add a group input. We'll call it start delay. And I'm going to drag this up. So this will make it wait. Let's try 2 seconds here. And make sure we got this right. If we shift left arrow, press spacebar, we don't see anything until about 2 seconds into the frame's animation. So that's good. And the last thing though, we only want to show the text here if we're under the total duration that this animation should play for. Total duration being the start delay, the typing duration, and then the pause afterward. So as long as we're under that time limit, we will show this actual geometry. So let's move that to the true, move that to the output. And the logic we need for that is if we compare the seconds, and we'll change it to less than. So as long as all of these, we'll say the group input of the start delay plus the group input of the typing duration, and then another math node here for a new group input called, we'll call it end delay. As long as we're within this time frame, we'll show that geometry. Otherwise, we just won't show anything. So we'll have to increase our end frame here. We'll just go up to 500, just arbitrary amount. And we'll press play here. There should be a wait. It'll start typing. And there's a bit of a delay. Let's actually turn that up to 3. And after 3 seconds, after that delay, all the text goes away. Perfect. So now what that'll let us do is chain these. So if we now duplicate this cube, actually let's F2 rename this to wake up. And then in the 3D viewport, I'm going to bring back the lines again with Alt-Shift-Z. Press Shift-D to duplicate that, right-click to cancel and leave it in place. But if we call this transform, we can see that the wake up has, let's actually change the delay on the wake up to 1 second delay, type for 4 seconds, and wait for 3 seconds. So that's 5, 6, 7, 8. That's an 8-second overall animation. So if we go to transform, we can wait 8 seconds at the start, type for 6 seconds, and end delay for 2. And of course, we need to change this text. So now if we play back our animation, we'll see the two messages played back to back. And you may have seen some of the letters come in a little bit out of order because of this variation that we've put here. So let's actually add another group input, and we'll call that variation strength, so that on each modifier we can change that. So we don't want it to be as strong for this longer text. So let's go back a little bit here. That's better. That was in order. All right, perfect. So now let's work on rendering this. We can go into the Layout tab. We'll tumble around, go to the front view. Let's jump to a frame where we can see. Okay, so that's our full message. So let's move this camera. I don't have a number pad, so I'm going to go to the View menu and align View and align Active Camera to View, which if you have a numpad, a keypad, it's Control-Alt, numpad 0, or Command Option numpad 0 on a Mac. Click that, and that will move the camera to the way we're seeing the viewport now. If I press N to bring up the sidebar and go to View, I'm going to lock the camera to the view, and that way I can, select the camera, press G, and move this around like so. And while I think about it, let's change this camera to, let's go to the Camera tab, change from Perspective to Orthographic, and change the scale just so we zoom out. And that will flatten the text. We don't get any weird perspective, which can distort the look of the font. So now we can just move our camera around, line that up in place, and let's go to the Output tab here. We set to 30 frames per second. I'm going to save the file to my temp directory, but let's change the format to FFmpeg and click to expand the encoding. Matryoshka is okay. And let's change the output quality to perceptually lossless. And I believe that should be good as far as the output goes. 1920 by 1080. And I'm good with Eevee since this doesn't have a lot of geometry to work with. We're just using geometry nodes for this text effect. So now the last thing to remember is to not just render the image, instead render the animation. But before we do that, we should probably double check which frame we want to end on. So about here is where all the text is. Till the frame all will snap all those frames into view here. That was handy. So 417 frames, and let's give it a bit of delay afterward. We're at 30 frames per second. Right there is where our delay ends, and it deletes itself. So we'll leave it at 479. So we'll change the end to 479, and make sure we have our material. We want the scene world. There you go. Sweet, I think it's good. Let's render it. So I hope you all enjoyed the tutorial and learned something new and useful. Let us know in the comments what was useful for you, or especially what may have been confusing for you. And if you enjoyed this Geometry Nodes tutorial with me, check out this other text animation tutorial that I did. I'm pretty sure you'll like it as well.